Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today, we're going to look at, on a geopolitical level, really what's happening in China, what's happening with China relations between the US, Asia, and other parts of the world. And also, let's tie this back to energy and what's really happening with China and how our oil flow is really starting to go. So one thing that we're going to really kind of, really jump in on is this chart that we've used before, which is the NineDash Line. So here, this is something where China had claimed the NineDash Line, the Philippines and others went to the UN arbitrations, and the UN arbitration found unanimously China doesn't have a claim. Now, the U.S. recognized the UN statutes and said, oh, well, based on the interpretations, we're going to go along with what they've said. Instead, we've just hardened our stance. We didn't change it. We just said, no, they're right. It is now state law. It's written within the State Department. The NineDash Line does not exist in the way we're going to travel and the way we respect the Philippines, Malaysia, other claims on these different islands. So it's just another ratchet up in terms of relations against China, where Chinese and U.S. relations continue to have some friction. Now, the reason why we thought it relevant to really kind of focus on this again is based on what happened in Houston and the issues within the consulates in terms of, we're asking China to vacate Houston. There's now rumors that China is going to ask the U.S. to vacate Wuhan. So again, it's just this ratcheting up of this Cold War rhetoric, which we've been really talking about aggressively since we not only launched the podcast, but also based on the writings that we've been doing since last year. And this has been a huge focus for me throughout my career. So it's really a big concern as we look at where you're putting more and more military assets, you're putting more friction within a very confined space. And one of the cool pictures that we got is the look of the USS Ronald Reagan Strike Group. Now, there are currently different activities and games going on in terms of maneuvers. And now the U.S. Ronald Reagan will be teaming up with Japan and Australia to do, different exercises, learning to work together. And there are now rumors that India will also be joining. Now, this doesn't include the other war games that are going to use live fire ammunition that's going to be with South Korea later I believe it's this month or next month. And again, it's just showing force. It's showing look, we're willing to work together to really kind of address that. Now, something that's been interesting is Japan, because Japan's only supposed to have a self-defense force based on the treaty that was signed right after World War II. But now, one of the things that they've changed since 2015 is the definition of the self-defense force. It's now being shown that they can help allies address an aggressor. And it was really changed to kind of address the growth of China and some of the pressures that they've seen. And obviously North Korea launching missiles over Japan or within Japanese territorial waters. They felt the need that they had to have a bit more aggression and a bit more ability to kind of go out and show force without just being a self-defense. So this is something that we have agreed to. It helps reduce some costs for us just because they're going to have their own military or at least some military equipment. And this is something where we're really kind of coming together and you're starting to see the lines getting drawn. And the reason why India has been so aggressively coming into this is again because of the friction that we continue to see at the LAC or the line of actual control, and that is something that is going to be another issue that we have to talk about. And the reason why we're going to talk about it is because, surprise, surprise, China did not pull back in specific locations that they said they were going to. And this is going to be the friction point where now India is looking at this and saying, okay, well, you said you were going to de-escalate, and now you're not pulling back where you're supposed to pull back. And this is going to be an area that India is not going to let up on, and neither is China. And this is why we have to really look at, well, what is happening What is India doing in response? So India is going to remain in specific areas. Finger 6 is just one of the areas that has some of the most geographical, as well as, on a supply chain, on a military level, the most strategic advantage, which is why that is an area that neither side really wants to give up. And China has not gone back to pre-set locations. And you can see kind of where things are. New Chinese encampments, where things have been created. They've opened a field hospital, and it's interesting because then the question is, well, where does Russia fall? Well, Russia and India have been very close and have had great ties, really going back to the 1200s. And in response to the Chinese ambush and the way this has been happening is Russia has said, look, we're going to send S-400 sooner, military equipment sooner, airplanes sooner, just to make sure India is prepared for what's coming. And the reason why is because Russia is also concerned. Several years ago, Russia invited China as a viewer to watch some of their war games that included about 30,000 Russian soldiers. Now, this wasn't a sign of friendship. It was a sign of, if you invade North, this is what we will do to you. And this is these little moving pieces that have been subtle, but now we're starting to come to a head as the economies continue to get weaker, as things continue to get stressed. And the Three Gorges Dam, as we've been talking about, they now have 7 floodgates open. Their flooding downstream is becoming massive. And at the same time, they've also blown up a dam upstream to help relieve some of the stress. So there is a lot of concern right now on just a global industrial level based on what's happening within China. And that's why we have to look at Iran. What's happening with Iran? What's happening with China and Iran at this point? So Iran, this is a great picture of all of the different explosions that we've seen over the last about a month now. And, China has signed up to try to give some aid, at the same time to buy Iranian crude for 25 years at a huge discount. Now, these are going to be huge problems going forward because the Iranian people, one, do not respect or like the way China has treated them, the coronavirus, all of the different components of, and at the same time, the Belt and Road Initiative and what's happened to those countries that have entered into these agreements. So this is going to be a huge friction point. And the reason why we're showing this again and really kind of harping on this specific chart is really because in Iran, you're getting this friction point again with, Israel has struck some key assets within Syria, within the, hitting Hezbollah locations. The U.S. has done airstrikes with Iran swearing that they're going to get the U.S. back, they're going to get Israel back. But again, the weakness is pronounced. And the weakness doesn't mean that they're not going to try to strike. They're not going to launch missiles or I shouldn't say missiles. They're not going to launch rocket attacks against both Israel and the U.S. It's just we're closing in, and they know that we're closing in, and they're losing a lot of these proxies, which is not, it's good for stability over the longer term, but it's also better for the way we're kind of functioning as a unit, because I do believe Iran will fall on the side of Russia, US, India, just based on not only history, but also where the populaces really kind of fall and how China is focusing and really acting as a bigger aggressor. One of the things that we've seen as well going into Western China is the Uyghur and what's happening there with the atrocities. We saw what happened in Britain when they called the ambassador from China to say, look, explain what's happening here. Why are these people chained, handcuffed, getting stuffed onto rail cars? And we've seen, the U.S. has passed legislation to sanction some of these individuals, to really highlight the human rights. And it's just concerning based on the advent of not only Hong Kong, but now what's happening in Xinjiang and now obviously India. So there's all these friction points that continue to get higher and higher. And you might think, well, why? Again, it's always going to come down to food, water, shelter. And the growing hunger problem is real. It's something that's only getting worse. We now have locusts. We have droughts. In some areas, we have massive flooding in others. And that's why we talk about the Three Gorges Dam, because you're destroying crops. not only are you seeing industrial production come down, Sinopec is cutting runs, you're seeing manufacturing getting flooded, you're also flooding farmland. And that is just making things worse. Now, this is going out to 2030. This is some estimates. We've talked about our own charts and our own estimates in terms of how bad things are getting, and this is just showing you it's all being pulled forward, which is why you have China acting out in such a way, because the NineDash Line also includes food. These are fishing locations. And when we consider the number of undernourished people, you can see Asia remains a big chunk of that. Obviously, Africa as well. And that Asia-African component, now these are obviously estimates, one can take over the other, but this is going to be a huge problem as we look at how is China reacting and what are their movements. Their movements have been towards areas that are large farmland, in terms of infrastructure as farmland, but also where do they make fertilizer? Where can they get access to arable land? And just food in general. I mean, they have deals with Brazil to get more soybeans. They've been buying more aggressively from the U.S. just because they're losing their own crops. And now you have Thailand, which is experiencing a drought. Again, global changes, climate change, and their rice just isn't really going to be, the rice crop isn't going to be what they expected. So now you have China that has to go out and make that up. But they have to do it on a sustainable level. And the aggression is not going to make it sustainable because they're going out and trying to take it. And this is going to be a bigger problem as we start to go through some of the macro factors within China, but also how does that implement across their supply chain and specifically into what drives the engine of industry, not only oil, but distillate. Now that we've talked about some of the geopolitical issues and we've talked about the Three Gorges Dam, now do I think this has a likelihood of collapsing? I would say less than 20% right now. But again, this is the second time it's been challenged. The last time it was challenged was in 2017. And if you're weakening the structure, there's no way to tell the river to pause so you can fix the issues. So this is going to be a continuous problem, especially when you have 7 of the floodgates wide open just because you have to release that pressure. And when we think about, okay, well, what's happening downstream? What's happening on an industrial level? And that's when we start to turn to the leverage and the different ratios across the globe. The one thing that we've always talked about was emerging markets. And a lot of these areas within the South China Sea are emerging markets. And there's ways to kind of, try to find opportunities within that entities. And here we just look at pension, healthcare spending liabilities. And now this is, you can see just from the top, several countries, there is a huge amount of liability within China itself. This is about 125 times GDP. But if you think about the debt ratio, so not only just on a pension healthcare liability, but also on a debt level, China's sitting with 325% above GDP in just inherent leverage. And that's why when we talk about, fixing the Three Gorges Dam, fixing some of these infrastructure projects, with what money, with what borrowing? And the pressure continues to increase because they're getting trade issues in terms of trade friction with the U.S. They're getting trade friction with other countries. India is actually a huge chunk of their trade relations. We have some of the data in one of our reports talking about how much trade China and India do with each other. And this is something that has to be considered when you think of the GDP ratios, because we know the pension and healthcare liabilities aren't going to go down, but the GDP could fall. So if GDP falls, all of these multiples just get worse. And that's why you're starting to see a lot of these problems across China and a lot of these other countries in terms of just the leverage on the emerging markets, which is why we think there is going to be a much bigger macro slowdown, even if COVID were to go away tomorrow with a vaccine or something else. Now, when we talk about, China, they've been aggressively building assets across their infrastructure, specifically refining. And now they've spent all this money. So now you've spent all this money, you have to turn them on to try to keep the lights on. So now you're going to see the problems within demand, which is already putting a record amount of refined products in storage. But now you have the Three Gorges Dam, the rivers, the tributaries, the Yangtze River that are overflowing, which is going to put even more pressure and is pushing demand even lower. Now with Sinopec cutting runs, other of the refiners cutting runs, you're going to see a huge boost in gasoline and gas oil exports. So now this is just looking at Platts in terms of what their estimates are for what they've seen for June and July. We've been saying from the beginning that May was the low because they were backfilling. April was they exported a huge amount. They were facing their own COVID issues, their own lockdowns, and now that they normalized, May was used to really backfill. Now they're back with, industrial production still at 87%, which is probably lower just given some of the issues. And if we look at electricity demand, so June and July, those exports are easily going to make up for what wasn't exported in May. And it's going to be a huge step up. So one of the quotes that we have right now is that Chinese diesel exports are expected to exceed 400,000 barrels a day in August. And it just gives you an idea of the trend that we're seeing and the demand that's happening within China itself, which again, coming back to what we talk about in the EIA, as China exports more of this product, that just means that India, South Korea, the Middle East is going to have to turn and export some of this, their own product into the European, Latin American market, which is U.S. typical markets. And now just looking at mounting pressure overall, just focusing a bit more on gasoline, this is what we were talking about. We saw May really drop hard. We saw a big recovery in June, essentially back to April levels. And now July is already outstripping June. And this is with refining utilization rates coming down in July, and it's just, there's a huge problem within China itself on a demand level, but also because the refinery runs were operating too hard. And now you have new issues that are happening within China that is, specific to the different floodings, but also just getting back to normal. Like they've had, upstarts of COVID, all of these different problems. And that's why there's more and more spot cargoes that are being offered. We've already seen oil get resold from China out to South Korea. They actually sold it cheaper than where they bought it by about 50 cents, which is a huge, if you think about, they're just taking losses just to clear some of the glut. And this is going to put a huge amount of pressure on gasoline spot pricing, which if you think about how weak crack spreads have been, it's not going to help crack spreads. It's going to make them worse because now you have to compete with cheaper product as China just dumps into the market. And when we think about dumping into the market and really what's happening, we have to consider there is technically a Chinese-U.S. trade deal. And this is just showing you one piece of that trade deal. Now, just to look at it from a yearly perspective, it's supposed to be 2017 is the base year. So we're supposed to be above 2017, and you can see where 2020 currently sits. Now, given we're at almost at the end of month 7, it's very unlikely, just given where pricing is, to close that gap. I mean, even if they came out and bought every piece of grain and softs that we sell, every piece of oil, you're just not going to get to this level. And based on the friction that's only increasing, it just isn't attainable. Like the trade deal is dead and gone. It's something that never was, and now you're seeing it in just straight math how it's something that's going to be problematic. And when we think about the way China's purchasing, we have to think of, not only just from the U.S., but also from their main suppliers, and one is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is seeing, typically they've reduced their burn rate over the last few years by utilizing more natural gas. But with the heat, with what's happening, just the cheap levels of oil, you might see them, increase their oil burn, which will take some oil off the market, which you might think, well, that'll be good because, China buys from Saudi as much as other places. But again, this Asian storage remains grossly oversupplied. So Saudi Arabia, Iraq, they all see this. They all know this. So that's why you're going to start to see some of these burns adjust, because might as well, look at this over the next, let's call it 6 months, in terms of the way Saudi Arabia is consuming their own oil for internal use. But again, COVID is limiting their local industry, their local movements, which is also going to be a weight in terms of where does the additional oil go to, which is going to be problematic. And when we talk about Asian markets, we have to talk floating storage, because again, floating storage remains grossly oversupplied based on just the 5-year. And again, it's Asia. It's not just China, but China is a huge part of that. And they've already started reselling. It's one of the things that we talked about with them selling Basra at such a discount. Again, this is a discount that we haven't seen since 2017. So they're getting desperate to clear some of this glut and to move it around to just, again, try to help pricing, but at the same time, just to alleviate some of the pressure at the ports, because they've also increased testing of COVID at the ports, which is putting more bottlenecks in place, which is slowing down imports, which is going to make this number sticky, which is why they're trying to do other things. And at the same time, are they slowing down ports because they're trying to hide how bad things are internally, saying, oh, no, things are fine internally. We're just trying to be proactive and protective. Well, it's something that we have to take with a grain of salt, but also we can look at this in straight movements. So that's why this is something to look at. And when we consider, okay, well, if Asia's oversupplied, what's happening further down the line with Middle East and West African storage? And here, if we take away 2016, you can see that we're back to, against the other months, we're back to seasonally adjusted near-term highs. And this is something where, based on just an increase in production, a decrease in terms of local utilization, and not just in Saudi Arabia, but across all of the Middle East, you're going to see these numbers. They don't have to really increase, but they can kind of stay in this level, because Asia or China is just not the buyer that they were, which is going to put more pressure, not only on the refined products, as we talked about, but on the physical oil market, even though Nigeria just increased pricing, because you can increase pricing, it doesn't mean someone's is going to buy it from you. And that's when we look to West Africa, and we've seen some of these issues in terms of West African floating storage just increasing. Again, it's decreased from the recent high, but again, it's against that seasonal average on a 5-year basis. It's still elevated. And now you have Angola increasing production in September, Nigeria maintaining their production. Cheaters are going to cheat. And that's what we've continued to see from Angola, Nigeria, and Iraq. And it's going to be problematic given, where the market is, because China's not a buyer. Asia as a whole, South Korea, Japan, India are starting to buy more. You're starting to see a little bit of a wake up in terms of their industrial production. But as we're going to talk about in the economy show, it's going to be a problem, because exports just aren't there the way they were. Even against 2019, 2018, they just continue to move on the wrong level. So these are specific assets that are going to be problematic. And the China issue just isn't going to go away. We think it's something that's going to continue to move along the wrong path. And, as we've been talking about, this is Cold War-esque type situations, especially with the consulate with, burning papers and now kicking one out, now reciprocating. UK is getting more aggressive. We have France and other European nations moving away from Huawei and the 5G network. So again, this is the economic impact that is real, and it always starts with economies. Then it moves to military strength and show of force, and then we've seen how this has ended on multiple different occasions throughout the last several centuries. And we can hope for the best, but again, we always want to prepare for the worst, and this is something that we're always going to keep our eye on, keep a pulse on. So again, if you have any questions, if you'd want to go through this in more detail, please reach out in the commentary. This is something that we've been very robust on and trying to stay in front of. So questions, comments, please drop them in the comment section. So we look forward to talking to you again. Stay tuned. We're going to have our EIA show coming out, our economy show, and then again, we're going to wrap up with our favorite segment on Friday, the Primary Vision Frac Spread Count. So thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.